He slid the envelope across the table without looking at her. No explanation, no apology. Just that slow, deliberate push of his hand like he was signing a contract, not ending a life. Inside was a photograph of Vivian Cross taken 11 years ago, standing outside a building she had spent a decade trying to forget. She was 17 in that picture, alone, frightened. And Roman Vescari had kept it in a locked drawer inside his private study, tucked beneath a blood-stained wedding invitation, with her name written across the front in ink that had dried the color of old rust. 3 nights before their wedding. She looked at him across the desk. He still hadn't moved. Ask Roman why your father really died. That was all the handwritten note said. If you were sitting where Vivian was sitting right now, looking at the man you planned to spend the rest of your life with, holding a photograph of yourself that he was never supposed to have, what would you do? If this story already has your attention, you know what to do. Subscribe to this channel and hit that like button so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Stay with me, because what Vivian found that night was only the beginning. The study smelled like leather and old paper, and something underneath both of those things that Vivian had never been able to name. She had been inside this room maybe a dozen times in the 2 years she and Roman had been together. Kept it locked when he wasn't home. He had given her the code 6 months ago, after they got engaged, and told her it was a sign of trust. She had believed him. She believed a lot of things about Roman Vescari that turned out to be architecture carefully designed, load-bearing, and hollow in the places that mattered most. She hadn't come in here tonight looking for anything. That was the part that kept catching in her chest like a splinter she couldn't reach. She had come in because the caterer had emailed about the final floral arrangement approval, and she needed to print the confirmation from Roman's printer because hers was out of ink, and the wedding was in 3 days, and there was always one more thing to handle, to confirm, to sign off on, to pretend was manageable. She had come in for paper. She found a blood-stained envelope instead. It was sitting on the desk, not hidden, not buried under anything. Just sitting there like it had been placed for her to find. Later she would wonder about that. Later she would spend a long time wondering whether Roman had left it there on purpose, some part of him that couldn't hold the weight of it anymore, finally making a decision his mouth refused to make. But that night, in the moment, she didn't wonder anything. She just stood there with the envelope in her hand and felt the room get very quiet. Her name was on the front, not Roman's, hers, Vivian. Just the one word. In handwriting she didn't recognize, in ink that had gone that dark reddish brown that ink goes when it's been on paper long enough to oxidize. Or when it isn't ink at all. She opened it. The photograph came out first. 8 by 10 glossy, the kind of print you got from a professional camera with a long lens. She was 17 in it, standing outside the Meridian building on West Jackson, which she knew because she had stood outside that building hundreds of times during the 18 months her father worked security there before he died. She was wearing the blue coat her mother had bought her for Christmas that year, the one with the broken zipper on the left pocket that she'd never gotten fixed because fixing it felt like admitting her mother was right, that she needed it. She didn't remember anyone taking her picture that day. She didn't remember anyone being there at all. Behind the photograph was the card. Heavy stock, cream-colored, the kind used for formal invitations. Her name was printed at the top in embossed lettering, Vivian Cross above, the date and time and venue of her own wedding. The wedding she had spent 8 months planning. The wedding that was happening in 72 hours. But someone had written across the bottom of it in that same dark, dried ink, "Ask Roman why your father really died." She stood there for a long time. She was not a woman who fell apart easily. That was something people said about her, and unlike most things people said about her, it was true. She had learned how to hold herself together the same way you learn how to drive in bad weather. Not because anyone taught you, but because the alternative was going off the road. Her father died when she was 17. Her mother followed 3 years later, quieter and slower, the grief doing what grief does when you let it settle in the bones. Vivian had finished college on loans and stubbornness. She had built a career in architectural consulting by being the person in the room who stayed calm when the drawings didn't match the structure. She stayed calm now. She put the photograph and the card back in the envelope. She set the envelope exactly where she'd found it on the desk. She walked out of the study, closed the door behind her, and went into the kitchen and put the kettle on, because her hands needed something to do. Then she stood at the counter and stared at the wall and tried to figure out what she actually knew. What she knew, Roman had a photograph of her from before they met, from when she was 17. The photograph had been kept in a locked room, alongside a blood-stained wedding invitation with a message on it that implied he knew something about her father's death that she didn't. What she didn't know everything else. She poured the tea when it was ready and didn't drink it. She and Roman had met at a fundraiser for the Chicago Architectural Foundation 2 years ago, an event she'd attended because her firm required it, and he'd attended because his family donated enough to have their name on a wall. She had known who the Vescaris were before she knew who Roman was. Everyone in Chicago knew who the Vescaris were, the same way everyone knows where the fault lines run in a city built on unstable ground. You don't think about it until the shaking starts. She'd told herself she was different, that Roman was different, that what they had was real in a way that didn't depend on what his last name came attached to. She had told herself a lot of things. The front door opened at 11:15. She heard his keys on the hook by the entrance, the particular sound his shoes made on the hardwood, the way he always paused just inside the door for 2 or 3 seconds, like he was leaving something outside before he came in. Vivi called. "Kitchen," she said. He came in looking tired, in the way he always looked tired after a long night. Not the surface exhaustion that shows in the eyes, but something deeper, structural, like whatever was holding him upright, was operating on reduced capacity. He was still in his suit jacket, which he usually took off in the car. He looked at her standing at the counter, and then at the untouched cup of tea on the countertop. "You okay?" he asked. "Long day," she said. "Caterer stuff." The floral confirmation. Right, he loosened his tie. "I meant to handle that. I got it." He opened the refrigerator and stood looking into it for a moment, without taking anything out. She watched the back of his head and thought about the photograph, about the handwriting, about the words, "Your father really died," and what the word really was doing in that sentence, what work it was being asked to carry. "Roman," she said. Do you ever think about what we're doing?" He closed the refrigerator and turned around. "That's a broad question for 11 at night." "I know." He looked at her more carefully then. He had always been good at reading her. It was one of the things she'd loved about him, early on, that feeling of being seen by someone who was actually paying attention. Now she kept her face quiet and watched him try to decide what he was looking at. "What's going on?" he said. "I'm just thinking about the wedding," she said. "About whether we've been honest with each other." Something moved behind his eyes. Fast, controlled, gone before most people would have caught it. But Vivian had spent 2 years watching Roman Vescari's face, and she caught it. "We've been honest," he said. "Okay," she said. She picked up her tea and went to bed. She didn't sleep. The next morning she told him she was spending the day with her friend Danny, doing last-minute wedding errands, which was partially true. She did meet Danny for coffee. She spent 40 minutes describing floral centerpiece options she didn't care about, and watching Danny's face light up, with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for Vivian to be a normal bride for the entire 8 months of the engagement. Then she went to the city records office on North Clark. She had the name of the building from the photograph, the Meridian Building, West Jackson. She knew her father had worked security there. What she'd never known, or never thought to question, was who owned it. The answer took her 40 minutes to find in the public records, and when she found it, she sat very still in the plastic chair in the records office and read it 3 times. The Meridian Building had been owned, in the year her father died, by a holding company called Lakeshore Property Management LLC. Lakeshore Property Management LLC was registered to an individual named Carlo Vescari, Roman's father. She pulled out her phone and took photographs of the documents. Then she went back to the beginning of the filing records and started looking for other connections, and found them a chain of properties, shell companies, financial relationships that spread across the city like roots under pavement, invisible until something broke through the surface. By the time she left, it was past 2 in the afternoon, and her phone had 11 missed calls from the florist, 3 from Roman, and 1 from a number she didn't recognize that had left no voicemail. She called Roman back first because not calling him back would tell him something. "Hey," she said when he picked up. "Sorry, it's been a day." Danny found a problem with the seating chart. "You sound weird," he said. "I'm stressed," she said. 3 days, Roman. A pause. You want me to come find you? I'm fine. I'll be home by 7. She went to the library next, the old main branch on Michigan with the archives. She asked for newspaper records from 11 years ago, specifically the month her father died, specifically the coverage around the Meridian building. Her father's death had been ruled an accident, a fall from a parking structure adjacent to the building where he worked. The official report said he'd been on a smoke break on the 3rd level and gone over the railing. The investigation lasted 4 days. The conclusion was accidental. Her mother had accepted it because the alternative, that someone had been himoto that railing deliberately, was a weight she didn't have the structure to carry. Vivian had accepted it too. What she found in the newspaper archive was a small item buried in the Metro section, published 6 days after her father's death, about an ongoing federal investigation into organized crime activity connected to several South Loop commercial properties. The article named no individuals. It referenced, in passing, a security contractor who had allegedly cooperated with investigators before dying under what federal sources called circumstances under review. Her father had been a security contractor. She sat with that for a long time. He hadn't just been a guard. He had been talking to federal investigators. He had been cooperating. And 6 days after he went over that railing, someone at the federal level was reviewing the circumstances of his death. And then the review stopped. The article was the last mention of it she could find. She drove home in the dark, with both hands tight on the wheel and the photograph in her bag, and a feeling in her chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage. It was something older and quieter than either of those. The feeling of a story you thought you knew, reshaping itself into something you don't recognize. Roman was in the living room when she got home. He'd made dinner, which he sometimes did when he felt guilty about something, or when he felt the distance between them and didn't know how else to close it. He'd made the pasta she liked, the one with the lemon and the capers, and he'd opened a bottle of the Barolo they'd been saving for a special occasion. She sat across from him and ate and talked about the seating chart and listened to him talk about a meeting he'd had downtown and watched his hands while he talked, those careful, still hands, the hands of a man who had learned very young to give nothing away through movement. "You seem better," he said. "I am," she said. "You seemed off this morning." "Pre-wedding nerves," she said and smiled at him, and the smile cost her something she couldn't calculate yet. After dinner, she helped clean up and then went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about her father. About the photograph of her at 17 standing outside the building owned by Roman's father. About the federal investigation that had started and then stopped. About the envelope left on a desk in an unlocked room. She thought about whether she was being careful or whether she was being foolish, and she couldn't tell the difference yet. What she knew was this: Roman had known her before he met her. Somehow, someway, he had known who she was before that fundraiser 2 years ago. And she was going to find out what that meant before she put on that dress. She waited until 2 in the morning. Roman was a heavy sleeper, not from trust or peace of mind, she understood now, but from practice, from years of training himself to turn off at will, because staying alert for too long would have broken him. She watched his breathing slow and even out, and then she got up and went downstairs and back into the study. This time she didn't come for the printer. She started with the filing cabinet he kept locked under the desk. She had found the key 3 months ago by accident. It had fallen between the couch cushions in the living room, and she'd set it on his desk without thinking, and she had forgotten about it until tonight. She found it now in the small tray beside the stapler. The cabinet had 4 drawers. The top 2 were business files, corporate documents, property records, financial statements for the legitimate holding company Roman ran as cover for whatever the family actually did. She photographed everything she recognized as significant. The 3rd drawer had personal files, old documents, insurance policies, some correspondence, and at the back, behind a manila folder labeled miscellaneous, a stack of photographs held together with a rubber band. She took them to the desk lamp. They were surveillance photographs, not of her father, dozens of them, spanning what looked like several months based on the seasonal clothing. Her father getting into his car. Her father meeting with 2 men she didn't recognize in what looked like a federal building lobby. Her father at the Meridian building, in uniform, standing outside the service entrance. And then, near the back of the stack, A photograph of her father with a younger man she almost didn't recognize because he was maybe 22 or 23, and his face was different then, less composed, still carrying something unguarded in it. Roman. Roman and her father in the photograph were not fighting. They were not exchanging documents or conducting any kind of transaction she could label. They were standing outside what looked like a diner, somewhere on the south side, and Roman had his hand on her father's arm, not aggressively, something closer to pleading or warning. And her father was looking at him with an expression she recognized from childhood as the expression her father used when he had already made a decision and someone was trying to talk him out of it. She set the photograph down. She picked it back up. Her father had been talking to federal investigators. Roman had known her father. Roman's family had owned the building where her father worked. Her father had died in what the official record called an accident. She understood, sitting there at 2 a.m. with her hands shaking for the first time all day, that she was not dealing with coincidence. She was dealing with architecture. Someone had built something carefully over a long period of time, and she was standing in the middle of it. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it. She photographed the Roman and her father photograph last, using her phone, and then she replaced the rubber band and the manila folder and relocked the cabinet and put the key back. She went back upstairs. Roman hadn't moved. She lay next to him in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to him breathe and thought about the word really again, why your father really died, and felt something inside her that had been soft for 2 years begin to go rigid. She was going to find the answer. She was going to do it quietly and completely, and she was not going to let him know. She was looking until she is enough to understand the whole shape of what had been done to her and to her father, and to the life she had believed she was living. 3 days. She had 3 days before she was supposed to walk down an aisle toward this man. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. The following morning, Roman woke first, which he rarely did. She heard him in the bathroom, heard him come out and pause at her side of the bed. She kept her breathing even, her face slack, the stillness of someone genuinely asleep, and after a moment he left the room. She waited 5 minutes. Then she got up and checked the study from the doorway. The envelope was gone from the desk. She stood in the doorway and looked at the empty spot where it had been and felt something shift in her chest, some last remaining piece of the story she'd been telling herself about who Roman Vescari was finally sliding out of place. He knew she'd been in there. He'd taken the envelope. He was watching her, and she was watching him, and neither of them was saying anything, and the wedding was in 2 days. She went to the kitchen and made coffee, and when Roman came down, she handed him his cup and asked him what time the rehearsal dinner started. 6:30 said. I need to be there by 6, she said. I want to check the table arrangement before the guests arrive. I'll drive you, he said. I'll take my car, she said. I might need to leave early. I told Danny I'd help her with something. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. She held his gaze the way she'd learned to hold things steadily, without resistance, giving nothing away. Okay, he said. But his eyes said something different, and she filed it away. She spent the morning making calls. She had one contact she'd never used before, a woman named Reyes, who worked at the Tribune and owed Vivian a favor from 2 years ago when Vivian had quietly passed along information about a zoning irregularity that Reyes had turned into a front-page story. She called Reyes from her car, parked in a lot 3 blocks from the house. I need to know about a federal investigation, Vivian said when Reyes picked up. 11 years ago. Organized crime South Loop Properties, a security contractor who died. Silence on the other end. Vivian, Reyes said carefully. What are you involved in? I'm trying to figure that out, Vivian said. Another silence. Then I remember that investigation. Barely. It got shut down fast. Word was someone at the federal level applied pressure, but that was never confirmed. The contractor, they said accidental. Unofficially, 2 people I spoke to said it wasn't. Vivian's hand tightened on the phone. There was a name that came up, Reyes said. In connection with the shutdown. Vescari. I never published it because I couldn't corroborate it. But it was there. Which Vescari, Vivian said. The father, Reyes said. Carlo. Vivian sat with that. Vivian. Whatever you're thinking about doing. Thank you, Vivian said. I'll be in touch. She ended the call and sat in the parking lot for a long time. Carlo Vescari had ordered the investigation shut down. Carlo Vescari had owned the building where her father worked. Carlo Vescari's son had a surveillance photograph of her father taken months before he died, and another photograph of himself with her father that looked like a warning being issued to a man who wouldn't listen. Roman had known. He had known that her father was going to die, and he had gone to that diner and he had tried to talk him out of whatever he was doing, and it hadn't worked, and her father had died anyway. And then, years later, Roman Vescari had found Vivian Cross at a fundraiser and looked at her across a room and made sure she fell in love with him. She thought about all of it. She thought about what it would mean if Roman had done it out of guilt, out of some genuine attempt at repair. She thought about what it would mean if he'd done it for something else entirely, to control what she knew, to keep her close, to manage the only surviving person who might one day start asking questions. She didn't know which one it was yet, but she's going to find out before she stood at that altar. She put the car in drive and pulled out of the lot, and as she did, her phone buzzed with a text from Roman. "Everything okay?" She stared at it at the next red light. "Everything's fine," she wrote back. "Just running errands." She hit send and watched the light change and thought, 2 more days. She could hold herself together for 2 more days. She drove back to the house with the radio off and the windows up and the particular kind of silence that isn't peaceful at all, the kind that has too much inside it pressing against the glass. Roman's car was in the driveway when she pulled in. He wasn't supposed to be home until 4. It was not yet noon. She sat in her car for a moment before going inside, not because she needed to collect herself, but because she needed to decide what version of herself was walking through that door. The one who didn't know anything, the one who knew everything. Or the somewhere in between, the one asking careful questions, feeling for the edges of a shape she couldn't fully see yet. She went with the middle one. She always had been better at the middle. Roman was at the kitchen table with his laptop open and 2 phones out, which meant something was happening in the part of his life he didn't tell her about. He looked up when she came in, and his face did that thing it did when he was managing multiple things at once, smoothed out, went carefully neutral, like someone had pressed a button marked composed. "You're back early?" he said. "Errand was faster than I thought," she said. She set her bag on the counter and took off her coat and opened the refrigerator because she needed somewhere to put her eyes that wasn't his face. "You said you'd be downtown until 4. Meeting got moved," he said. She took out a bottle of water and closed the refrigerator. "Everything okay?" "Fine," he said, "just a scheduling thing." She nodded and went upstairs to change clothes, and she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself have exactly 90 seconds of feeling the full weight of what she knew. Her father, the photograph, Carlo Vescari's name attached to a federal investigation that got shut down, Roman in that diner with his hand on her father's arm, and then she put it away, folded it up, and set it aside like something she'd return to when the room was safer. She changed into jeans and a sweater and went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table across from him and opened her laptop like she was reviewing vendor invoices for the wedding reception. She was actually looking for more. The financial records she'd photographed from Roman's filing cabinet were structured to be confusing. That was the point of them, she understood. Shell companies nested inside other shell companies, property holdings filtered through holding groups that didn't have names so much as they had letter sequences, LLCs stacked like geological layers. She'd worked in architecture long enough to know that the buildings that look simplest on the outside are often the ones with the most load-bearing work happening in the walls. She found the second property in 40 minutes, a warehouse on the south side, registered to the same Lakeshore Property Management LLC that had owned the Meridian building when her father died, currently listed as a storage facility. What it was actually being used for, the documents didn't say, but there was a pattern of maintenance expenses that looked wrong for a building's supposedly holding nothing but inventory security system upgrades, reinforced entry installation, lighting work done by a contractor that didn't appear anywhere else in any public record she could find. She photographed what she was looking at on her laptop screen with her phone, keeping the motion small and unremarkable. Across the table, Roman's fingers moved on his keyboard in short, controlled bursts. She could hear both his phones, one on silent, the screen lighting up every few minutes, one on low volume. Receiving calls, he let go to voicemail. "You seem distracted," she said. He looked up. "Work thing. I'll have it sorted before tonight. Tonight's the rehearsal dinner." "I know what tonight is, Viv." The edge in his voice was new. Not loud. Roman was rarely loud, but it was there, a hardness underneath the words that hadn't been there 2 days ago, or that she hadn't let herself hear 2 days ago. "I know you do," she said, and went back to her screen. Danny called at 1:30 as planned, which gave Vivian a reason to step outside. She walked to the far end of the backyard, past the garden that the previous owners had planted, and that neither she nor Roman had ever gotten around to maintaining properly, all overgrown salvia and collapsed trellises. She stood near the back fence, where the neighbor's oak hung over the property line, and she spoke quietly. "I need a favor," she told Danny, "and I need you to not ask me questions about it until after Saturday." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Vivian, I know. Is this about Roman?" "I need you to hold on to something for me," Vivian said. "Some photographs. I'm going to email them to you, and I need you to save them somewhere that isn't your phone." "How worried should I be right now?" Danny said. "Not a question. A calibration. Just save the photographs," Vivian said. "Don't look at them. If I call you Saturday morning before 10 and I tell you everything is fine, delete them. And if you don't call, then look at them," Vivian said. "And call someone who knows what to do with what you're looking at." A silence. Then, "Okay, thank you, Vivian. Are you safe right now?" She looked back toward the house. Roman had moved. She could see him standing at the kitchen window, not looking at his phone or his laptop, looking out at the yard. Looking at her. "Yes," she said. "I'll call you before the rehearsal dinner." She ended the call and walked back toward the house, and Roman held the door open for her when she reached it, and she said, "Thank you," and he said nothing. And the space between them in the doorway was maybe 18 inches, and it felt like the width of something that couldn't be measured in distance. She sent the photographs to Danny from the upstairs bathroom with the fan running. Then she sat on the closed lid of the toilet and went through everything again, methodically, the way she organized structural assessments at work, starting with what was confirmed, moving to what was probable, stopping clearly at what was speculation. Confirmed, Roman had surveillance photographs of her father taken before his death. Roman had a photograph of himself with her father that appeared to show a private meeting. Roman's father had owned the building where her father worked and had been connected, at least nominally, to the federal investigation that ended abruptly after her father died. The blood-stained envelope with her name on it had been in Roman's study and was now gone. Probable, Roman had known who Vivian was before they met at the fundraiser. The meeting was not accidental. Their entire relationship had been initiated by him with knowledge she didn't have. Not yet confirmed, but not dismissible, what Roman's role had actually been in whatever happened to her father. Whether the warehouse on the south side connected to anything she needed to know about. What the warning on the card meant, "Ask Roman why your father really died, and who had written it, and why it had appeared now, 3 days before the wedding." That last question was the one pulling at her most insistently. Because the envelope had been placed on the desk, not mailed. Not slipped under a door, set there deliberately, with her name on it. Someone's inside the house, or someone with access to the house, had put it there for her to find. Someone other than Roman, or Roman himself. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed. She had to get through the rehearsal dinner tonight. She had to sit at a table across from Roman's family, from Roman's uncle, Marcus Vescari, a man she had met 4 times, and each time felt the specific discomfort of being assessed by something that didn't particularly value what it was looking at, and she had to be Vivian Cross, bride, calm and composed, and 3 days from happy. She stood up, ran cold water on her wrists, and went to get ready. The rehearsal dinner was at Carmen's, a private room in the back that the Vescaris had reserved with the kind of ease that comes from having used a place so many times it no longer needed to be booked so much as notified. Vivian had been there twice before with Roman for family dinners, and both times she'd had the precise feeling of being a guest in a house where the furniture was arranged for purposes she didn't fully understand. She arrived at 5:58. Roman arrived at 6:10, which meant he'd been somewhere between the house and the restaurant, for time she couldn't account for. She watched him work the room in the way he did at these things, easy, controlled, the particular warmth he turned on in social situations that was real enough to feel genuine, but measured enough to never give more than was strategic. He was good at it. She had always found it attractive, that ability. She was reconsidering what she found attractive. Marcus Vescari arrived at 6:20. He was Roman's father's brother, which meant he was old enough to have been there for all of it. The building of the Vescari operation through the 80s and 90s, the consolidation of the South Side holdings. Whatever had happened to her father 11 years ago. He was a compact, watchful man with gray at his temples and the particular stillness of someone who had learned that showing nothing costs nothing. He'd always been polite to Vivian in the way that just barely cleared the bar for polite. He came to find her first before Roman brought him over. That was new. Vivian, he said. He kissed her cheek, which he'd done before, but this time his hand stayed on her arm a half-second longer than it needed to. Pre-wedding, she said. Of course. He smiled. It didn't reach anything above his chin. Roman tells me you've been very busy this week. Running around the city. Her pulse moved, but she kept her face where she'd put it. Always something to handle. Always, he agreed. He studied her for a moment with those flat, quiet eyes. You know, I've always admired how composed you are. Even under pressure. He paused. It's a valuable quality. In this family. He said it like a test, and she treated it like a compliment, and he moved away to speak to Roman. And she turned toward the bar and waited for her hands to steady. He knew she was looking. Or he suspected. Either way, the message had been delivered with the same precision as the envelope set, down in front of her, without a fingerprint on it. Dinner was 40 people and 2 hours, and a series of toasts that Vivian sat through with a fixed smile and a glass of wine she barely touched. Roman gave a speech about their relationship that was good, genuinely good. The kind of speech that made several women at the table press their fingers to their eyes, and she watched him while he gave it, and tried to locate the lie inside it, and couldn't quite, which was perhaps the most frightening thing of all. Because she didn't think he was lying in the speech. She thought he meant it. She thought Roman Vescari was standing there, with a room full of people looking at him and saying entirely true things about loving her, and that none of those true things negated any of the other things that were also true. And that was the thing she hadn't been prepared for. That love and deception weren't opposites, that a person could hold both without the seams showing. She gave her own short speech. She heard herself say, I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with this man. And she watched Roman's face while she said it, and she thought, tell me. Tell me right now, give me something. He didn't. He raised his glass and smiled at her, and the smile was warm and private in the way his smiles sometimes were. The ones that felt like they were only for her, and she smiled back and thought, 2 more days. They drove home separately because she had her car. That was 40 minutes she spent on the interstate in the dark, running through what she'd need to do tomorrow. The warehouse address she'd found, whether she could get inside or at least close enough to understand what it was. What other records she might find if she went back into the filing cabinet with more time and more clarity about what she was looking for. Roman was waiting in the living room when she got home. He'd loosened his tie and taken off his jacket, and he had a glass of scotch sitting on the coffee table that looked like it had been poured a while ago, but not touched. Sit down, he said. She looked at him. I'm tired, Roman. Vivian. Sit down. She sat. He didn't sit. He stood near the window with his arms at his sides, and he looked at her for a long moment, and she kept very still and held his gaze and waited. What have you been doing, he said. Not loudly. Quiet the way a room gets quiet before something breaks in it. What do you mean? You know what I mean. I've been handling wedding logistics, she said. Same as I've been doing for 8 months. You went to the city records office yesterday. Her stomach dropped, but her face didn't. How do you know that? I know a lot of things, he said. That's the problem. Is it, she said. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and for the first time in 2 years, she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the composed control she was used to, but something underneath it, something raw and exhausted, and very close to the surface. I need you to stop, he said. Whatever you're looking for. I need you to stop. Why? Because it isn't safe. A safe for who? His jaw tightened. Vivian. For you. She looked at him, at the tiredness in him, at the genuine fear she could see underneath the control, and she kept her voice even and she said, Roman. Did you know my father? The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. Counted. Yes, he said. The word landed like a door closing. Before he died, she said, yes. Before we met. Yes. She pressed her lips together. She breathed through her nose. She looked at the untouched scotch on the coffee table, and then at his hands, and then at his face. How long have you known who I was? She asked. He didn't answer. Roman, since before the fundraiser, he said. She stood up. She didn't do it dramatically. She just needed to be on her feet, needed the floor under her, needed gravity to be doing its job. She walked to the window and stood there and looked out at the dark street. You need to tell me, she said. All of it. Right now. I can't, he said. Not here, not tonight. Why not tonight? Because if I tell you everything tonight, there are people who will know by morning that I told you, he said, and that will put you in a position I spent years making sure you never had to be in. She turned around. What position? He looked at her, and his face was the most honest she had ever seen it, which was a particular kind of terrible, because it meant that every other time she had thought he was being honest, he had been performing a version of it. The position your father was in, he said. She felt the cold move through her in a slow wave, starting somewhere below her ribs. Your family killed him, she said. He didn't look away. My father ordered it. And you. I tried to stop it. And you, she said again, the words quiet and specific, a scalpel, not a hammer. I was 22, he said. I went to him. I warned him. He wouldn't stop cooperating with the feds. His voice had gone rough. He was a decent man who made a dangerous decision, and I tried to talk him out of it, and he looked at me the same way you're looking at me right now. Like you were lying, she said. Like I was the one responsible for what was coming, regardless of who pulled the trigger. She held that. Were you, she said? He said nothing, which was an answer. She picked up her coat from the back of the couch. She picked up her keys, Vivian. I need to not be in this room right now, she said. It's midnight. I know what time it is. Please don't. Roman. She stopped. She turned around and looked at him, and made sure he could see her clearly, all the way through. If you try to stop me from walking out of this house tonight, I will know exactly who you are. Do you understand me? He stood very still. He let her go. She drove to Danny's without calling first, and Danny opened the door in pajamas and took one look at Vivian's face and stepped back to let her in without saying anything, which was the greatest act of friendship Vivian had ever received. She sat on Danny's couch, and she did not cry. She felt like crying, but crying out required a kind of release she couldn't afford yet, a loosening of something she needed to keep tight until she'd made the decisions that still needed making. She told Danny the outline of it, not the details. Those were too complicated for midnight on a couch, but the shape of it, Roman had known her father. Roman's family had been involved in her father's death. Roman had known who she was before they met. Danny listened without interrupting, which was not natural for Danny, which told Vivian how serious Danny understood this to be. The photographs I sent you, Vivian said. Keep them. I will. I'm going to the warehouse tomorrow, Vivian said. What warehouse? There's a property connected to Roman's family. On the south side. I need to see what's there, Vivian. That is insane. I know. I'm coming with you. You're not. Then you're not going. Vivian looked at her. I have to know what he's been hiding. All of it. Not just the pieces he's willing to hand me. And if someone's at the warehouse? I'm not going inside, Vivian said. I just need to see it. Understand what it is. Danny was quiet for a long moment, her jaw set, working through it. If you're not back by 2 tomorrow afternoon, I'm calling someone. Okay. Who do I call? Vivian thought about it, Reyes. At the Tribune. I'll give you her number. Danny nodded slowly. What are you going to do about the wedding? Vivian looked at her hands. The engagement ring caught the lamplight, a clean, beautiful thing, chosen with care, meaning everything it was supposed to mean when it was put on her finger, and possibly meaning something else entirely. I don't know yet, she said. She slept on Danny's couch for 5 hours, with her phone face down on the cushions beside her, and woke up to 3 missed calls from Roman and a text that said simply, I'm sorry. That's not enough, and I know it, but I need you to come home. She didn't respond. She got up, washed her face, borrowed a sweater from Danny's closet, drank the coffee Danny had made, and left for the warehouse at 8:45 in the morning, one day before her wedding. The Southside address was a nondescript block of industrial buildings near the rail yards, the kind of Chicago geography that looks like nothing from a car window, flat and utilitarian, the city's working infrastructure hiding in plain sight. She parked 2 blocks east and walked. The warehouse was a 2-story brick building behind a chain-link fence, no signage, a reinforced steel door at the front, and the kind of security camera, placement 4 visible angles, and she clocked at least 2 more partially obscured by roofline overhang that told her this was not a building that stored inventory. She didn't go to the front. She walked the perimeter, keeping half a block of distance, noting the exits, the delivery bay at the rear, the window placements on the second floor. There was a car parked in the delivery bay, a black sedan, recent model, no plates visible from where she stood. She photographed it from a distance. She was turning to walk back to her car when her phone rang. Roman. She stood on the sidewalk in the October cold and let it ring twice, 3 times. Then she picked up. "Where are you?" he said. "Out," she said. "Vivian." His voice was different, tighter, something moving underneath it she hadn't heard before. "I need you to come home right now. We've had this conversation. This isn't about last night," he said. "Something happened this morning. I need you." He stopped. She heard him breathe. "I need you to not be wherever you are right now. I need you somewhere I know you're safe." "Why?" she said. "Because my uncle knows you've been asking questions," he said. "And Marcus doesn't. He's not like me, Vivian. He doesn't have a line he won't cross." She looked at the warehouse, at the camera angles she'd been standing inside for the last 10 minutes. "Roman," she said carefully, "am I on a camera right now?" A silence that lasted too long. "Which warehouse?" he said. His voice had gone very flat. "Vivian, which warehouse are you at?" She was already walking. "The Lakeshore property," she said. "South side." She heard him exhale, not a sigh, something more involuntary than that. The sound a person makes when the thing they feared most just became the thing that's happening. "Get in your car," he said. "Right now. Don't look back at the building. Walk normally. Get in your car and drive north and call me when you're moving. Roman, Vivian." His voice cracked on the second syllable. Not theatrically, barely audibly. The sound of something giving way that had been held in place a very long time. "Please, I will tell you everything. Everything. But you have to get away from that building first." She rounded the corner. Her car was in sight. She kept her pace even. "My uncle has people watching that location," Romans said. "They saw you there. Then they saw me," she said. "You don't understand what that means." She reached her car, unlocked it, got in. She started the engine. "Then explain it to me," she said. "You have the whole drive north." She pulled away from the curb and didn't look in the rearview mirror, and Roman started talking, and what he said over the next 20 minutes changed the shape of everything she thought she knew, not by revealing something new, but by confirming something she had been hoping, somewhere private and stubborn inside herself, was not true. He had witnessed it, not arranged it, not ordered it. But he had been there, on the night her father died, in the parking structure on West Jackson, because his father had sent him as a lesson. This is what accountability looks like in this family. This is what happens when someone decides their conscience matters more than their obligations. And he had watched, from the second level, as 2 men he recognized took her father up the stairs, and Roman had not stopped it, and he had. Not called anyone, and he had not said a single word. He was 22 years old, and he had watched her father die, and then he had spent the next 11 years trying to figure out how to live with it. She drove north through the city and said nothing, and Roman kept talking, and the traffic moved around her, and the sky above the highway was the color of old concrete. And somewhere to the south, the warehouse with the camera angles was watching the space where she'd been standing and finding it empty. She pulled off the highway at Fullerton. She parked in a lot. She sat. "Are you there?" Roman said. "I'm here," she said. "Vivian, say something." She looked at the cars moving past on Fullerton Avenue. Ordinary cars, ordinary morning, people going to ordinary places. "You watched him die," she said. "Yes, and then you found me." "Yes, and you let me fall in love with you." The pause before he answered was the longest of all. "Yes," he said. She ended the call. She sat in the parking lot at Fullerton and Halstead on the morning before her wedding, and she pressed both hands flat against the steering wheel, and she breathed in and out, steady and controlled, until the shaking in her chest had nowhere left to go, and she absorbed it the way she'd always absorbed the things she couldn't put down. Her phone lit up with his name again. She didn't answer. She thought about the warehouse, about Marcus Vescari's hand on her arm last night, the half-second too long, about the cameras, about the black sedan with no plates in the delivery bay. She thought about what Roman had said. Marcus doesn't have a line he won't cross. And she understood, sitting in that parking lot in the October cold, that she was no longer just a woman asking questions about her father's death. She had been seen at the warehouse. She had been documented. She had connected herself, visibly and on camera, to evidence that Marcus Vescari needed to keep buried. The wedding was tomorrow, and she was now standing exactly where her father had stood 11 years ago, in possession of knowledge that a dangerous man needed her not to have, with no clear line between her and the consequence of that. Picked up her phone. She didn't call Roman. She called Reyes. "I need to meet today," she said when Reyes picked up. "And I need you to bring someone from your legal desk. Someone who knows how to handle evidence in a way that protects the person handing it over." "Vivian." Reyes' voice sharpened immediately. "What did you find?" "Everything," Vivian said. Reyes picked a diner on Wabash that she knew, because it had a back booth with sightlines to both exits and the kind of ambient noise that made recording difficult. She arrived 12 minutes after Vivian called, which meant she'd been close, which meant some part of her had been waiting for this call. The woman she brought was not from the legal desk. She was small and precise and introduced herself only as Claire, and she set a leather portfolio on the table and folded her hands on top of it and looked at Vivian with the calm attentiveness of someone who assessed risk for a living and had learned not to show what she found. "I'm a federal prosecutor," Claire said. "Reyes called me 6 months ago when she started pulling threads on the Vescari organization. I've been waiting for someone on the inside to come forward." Vivian looked at Reyes. "You're not on the inside," Reyes said quickly. "But you're close enough. How long have you been building a case?" Vivian said. "Long enough," Claire said. "But we have gaps, specifically around a series of properties on the south side and a death 11 years ago that was ruled accidental." She paused. "A security contractor named David Cross." Vivian's father's name in a federal prosecutor's mouth felt like a door opening in a wall she hadn't known was there. "He was my father," Vivian said. Claire didn't flinch. She had known. "I know, that's why I came." Vivian laid her phone on the table and opened the photographs, the financial documents, the property records, the surveillance shots of her father, the photograph of Roman and her father outside the diner. Claire went through them without touching the phone, bending slightly to read, her face doing nothing that Vivian could interpret. When she finished, she sat back and looked at Vivian directly. "The warehouse you went to this morning," she said. "Don't go back, I wasn't planning to. Marcus Vescari uses that location for document storage. Physical records that don't exist in any digital system. We've known about it for 8 months and we haven't been able to get inside because we don't have sufficient probable cause for a warrant." She looked at Vivian's photographs again. "These property records change that calculation. Slightly. But we need more." "How much more?" Vivian said. "We need someone who can place Marcus Vescari at the scene of your father's death, or connect him directly to the order. Roman's testimony would do it. But Roman hasn't spoken to us, and I doubt he will." "Confessed to me this morning," Vivian said, "on a phone call." Claire looked at her. "He told me he was there," Vivian said. "In the parking structure, the night my father died. He witnessed it. The diner noise moved around them, coffee cups, a short order bell, someone laughing at the counter." "That's not evidence," Claire said. "Not without corroboration." "What if I could get him to say it again?" Vivian said. "On record." Reyes started to say something. Claire stopped her with a small motion of her hand. "That would require you to be in contact with him while wearing a recording device," Claire said, "which requires your informed consent and a significant degree of personal risk." "I'm aware," Vivian said. "Your wedding is tomorrow." "I'm aware of that, too," Vivian said. Claire studied her for a long moment. "What do you want out of this, Miss Cross?" Vivian thought about it. Not long, she'd been thinking about it since the parking lot on Fullerton. "I want to know that what happened to my father gets counted," she said. "I want someone to say, in an official proceeding, with records attached to it, that David Cross cooperated with federal investigators and was killed for it, and that the people who ordered it are held accountable." She paused. "That's what I want. And Roman Vescari. He was 22 and he watched and he didn't stop it," Vivian said. "That's its own kind of answer. I'm not asking you to protect him." Claire nodded once. She opened the leather portfolio and took out a single page and slid it across the table. "Read that," she said. "Don't sign it today. Sleep on it or what passes for sleep under the circumstances. If you decide to proceed, call the number at the bottom before noon tomorrow." Vivian looked at the page. It was a cooperation agreement, short and precise, outlining her rights and protections, and the specific scope of what she was agreeing to provide. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "One more thing," she said. "Roman told me his uncle knows I've been asking questions. If Marcus Vescari has people watching me, we'll have someone on you by tonight," Claire said. "You won't see them, but they'll be there. That's not particularly comforting." "No," Claire agreed, "it isn't." She drove back to the house at noon, and Roman's car was gone, and the house had that specific quality of emptiness that is different from being simply unoccupied. Something had happened in it, recently, some agitation that hadn't fully settled. She stood in the front hallway and listened to the silence, and then checked the study. The filing cabinet was open, not broken open with the key. Several folders were gone. The drawer that had held the surveillance photographs of her father had been cleared out completely. She stood and looked at the empty space in the drawer and felt something in her chest that wasn't quite betrayal and wasn't quite relief, because she'd already moved everything that mattered before he'd had a chance to reach it. The photographs were on Danny's hard drive and in the cloud storage she'd set up 2 nights ago under an email address Roman didn't know existed. He was erasing himself. That was what this was. He was pulling the physical evidence before she could use it. What he didn't know was that she'd photographed all of it. She went upstairs and sat on the bed and looked at the room she'd shared with this man for 18 months and tried to locate some grief inside herself and found that it was there, genuine, heavy, real underneath everything else. She had loved him. She was clear on that. She had loved Roman Vescari with her eyes open about certain things and closed about others. And the problem with loving someone who has been careful about what they let you see is that when you finally see everything, the love doesn't vanish. It just becomes more complicated than you have language for. She didn't have time for complicated right now. She packed a bag. Not everything, just what she needed for a week. She was not panicking, and she was not fleeing. She was making a practical decision about where to sleep on the night before her wedding, given that the man she'd planned to marry had just confessed to witnessing her father's death and was currently removing evidence from their shared home. She called Danny. "I'm coming back tonight." "Obviously," Danny said. "I already made up the bed in the spare room." She put the bag in her car and went back inside and stood in the living room one more time. The wedding dress was upstairs, hanging in a garment bag in the walk-in closet. She'd picked it up from the boutique 3 weeks ago and hung it there, and every morning since she'd walked past it on her way to the bathroom and felt the particular complicated pleasure of something beautiful waiting for an occasion to justify it. She left it where it was. She was at the kitchen counter writing a note short. Just, "I need space today. I'll be at Danny's. We need to talk tonight." Not here. When the front door opened, Roman came in still wearing his coat. He saw her immediately, saw the bag she'd set by the door, and his face went through something. She couldn't entirely track relief that she was here, dread at the bag. Something's underneath both that looked like a man arriving at a moment he had spent a long time knowing was coming. "You were at the warehouse," he said. "I told you that on the phone." "You were on their cameras for 9 minutes, I know," she said. He pressed both hands flat against the kitchen island, leaning on it like it was the only fixed point in the room. "Marcus called me an hour ago. He knows it was you." "What did you tell him that I'd handle it? What does handling it mean in Marcus Vescari's vocabulary?" she said. Roman's jaw worked. "It means making sure don't become a problem." "And what does a problem look like?" Vivian, what does a problem look like, Roman?" Her voice stayed level. She needed it level. He looked at her across the kitchen, and his eyes were doing something she hadn't seen before. A rawness, a visibility, like whatever filter he'd spent 20 years building had developed a crack he couldn't repair with will alone. "My uncle is not a careful man," Roman said. "My father was careful." "Marcus is efficient. There's a difference. Your father was careful enough to have my father killed and make it look like an accident," she said. "Yes, and Marcus is less particular about how things look." Roman said nothing, which was everything. She picked up the note she'd written and set it on the counter. "I'm going to Danny's. I need tonight." "You can't go out there alone," he said. "Not tonight, Vivian, I mean it. I'm not your responsibility to manage," she said. "That's not what I'm doing, isn't it?" She looked at him steadily. "You've been managing me since before we met, deciding what I should know, deciding what I deserve to be protected from, deciding that 2 years of a built life was an acceptable trade for the truth about my father." She picked up her bag. "That ends tonight." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and his hand came to her arm. Not grabbing, not restraining, just landing there. The contact of a man who had run out of words and was reaching for something more immediate. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She could see it clearly, the genuine terror, the genuine love. Both of them real, both of them insufficient. I need you to listen to me, he said. Not about us. About Marcus. He has people outside this house right now. He had someone follow you to that diner on Wabash. Stomach tightened. He doesn't know who you met, Roman said. Not yet. But if he finds out you've been talking to anyone official Vivian, he will not give me the latitude to handle it. He will decide you are a liability, and he will act on that decision, and I will not be able to stop him in time. She looked at him for a long moment. Then what do you suggest? She said. Come with me tonight, he said. There's somewhere I need to show you. Something I should have shown you a long time ago. And I need to do it while Marcus still thinks I'm managing this, because the window for that is closing fast. Where? She said. He hesitated, which was not something Roman Vescari did easily. The warehouse. She stared at him. You want to take me to the warehouse that your uncle's people just watched me standing outside of. Not the main entrance. There's a secondary access from the rail yard side. I have a key. Marcus doesn't know I have it. He looked at her with that visible cracked thing in his face. I've been keeping evidence there. Evidence about everything my father, your father, the properties, the federal contacts. I kept it because I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And now I do. She thought about Claire's voice at the diner table. We need someone who can place Marcus Vescari at the scene of your father's death, or connect him directly to the order. Physical records that don't exist in any digital system. She thought about the cooperation agreement in her coat pocket. Tonight, she said. Tonight, he said. After dark. When Marcus's people change shifts, there's a 20-minute window between 11 and 11:20. We go in, I show you what I have, and then he stopped. And then you decide what to do with it. I won't ask you for anything after that. I won't ask you to stay. I won't ask you to forgive anything. I need you to have the whole truth before you make any decision about any of it. She looked at him and thought about all the ways this could be exactly what he said it was, and all the ways it could be something else entirely. And she understood that she was going to have to choose between those two possibilities, without enough information to be certain, which was the position she'd been in for 2 years, and simply hadn't known it. I'll meet you there, she said. I'm not going with you. I'll drive myself and I'll meet you at the rail yard access at 11. He wanted to argue. She could see it. He swallowed it. Okay, he said. She walked out of the house. She spent the afternoon at Danny's, and at 4 o'clock she called the number at the bottom of Claire's cooperation agreement. Claire answered on the second ring. I'm going to the warehouse tonight, Vivian said. With Roman. He says he has physical evidence inside. Documents, records. A silence that lasted several seconds. Tell me the address and the time. Vivian gave her both. Do not go inside before 11:15, Claire said. I need time to position people. And Vivian, if anything changes before then, if Roman changes the plan or the location, you call me immediately. Understood, Vivian said. One more thing. Claire's voice shifted slightly. What Roman told you this morning, about witnessing your father's death. If that evidence is in the warehouse, if his involvement is documented, the cooperation agreement protects you, but it doesn't automatically protect him. You understand that. I understand, Vivian said. She ended the call and sat in Danny's spare room, looking at the wall and letting herself feel, for the first and only time that day, the full shape of what tomorrow was not going to be. Not the wedding, not the dress in the garment bag, not the 40 people she'd spent 8 months arranging into a room for a celebration of something she'd believed in completely. She felt it. She let it move through her. She did not cry. Then she got up and helped Danny make dinner, and they talked about inconsequential things, and she was grateful for every word of it. She arrived at the rail yard access at 10:58. It was the kind of Chicago night in late October that feels like the city is reminding you what it can do. The cold coming off the lake with genuine intention, the sky a flat black without enough stars to soften it. The rail yard access was a chain-link gate, set into a concrete wall, padlocked, tucked between 2 industrial buildings that had been closed long enough that the graffiti on their walls had its own layers. Roman was already there. He had a flashlight off in his left hand and a small key in his right. He looked at her when she came around the corner, and something in his face settled, like he'd been holding his breath since she'd left the house. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. He unlocked the gate. They went through. The rail yard side of the warehouse was a loading dock, wide and concrete, the overhead door closed and padlocked. Roman went to a regular-sized door set into the wall to the left of the loading dock, and he used a different key, and it opened. Inside was dark. He turned on the flashlight. The interior was split into 2 levels, a concrete ground floor with shelving unit running its length, and an open second level reached by a steel staircase. The shelving units held boxes, dozens of them, identical, brown cardboard, labeled in a system of numbers and letters she didn't know. Roman took her up the stairs. The second level was different. At the far end, walled off with temporary partitioning, was a room inside the room, a space maybe 15 feet square, accessed through a door that locked from the inside. Roman unlocked it, and she followed him in. What she saw stopped her in the doorway for a full 3 seconds. Filing boxes, floor to ceiling on 2 walls, a folding table with a banker's lamp on it, battery-operated, which Roman clicked on. And on the table, arranged in neat stacks, a series of documents she recognized immediately as the kind of primary source material that makes a federal prosecutor's case. Not copies, not digital scans, but original records. Signed orders, financial ledgers in handwriting, photographs with dates and location stamps, correspondence on letterhead with names at the bottom. "How long?" she said. 8 years, he said. "I started taking things after my father died. After the organization transferred to Marcus. He stood by the table with his hands at his sides. I didn't know what I was building toward. I just knew I couldn't let it disappear." She moved to the table and looked at the documents without touching them. Her eye went immediately to a folder at the top of the nearest stack, labeled with a date, the month and year her father died. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typewritten, dated 3 days before her father died. At the top, a name she recognized as a front company she'd found in the financial records. At the bottom, Carlo Vescari's signature. In between, in the clipped operational language of a man conducting business, instructions for a specific action to be taken against a specific individual, her father's name, his address, his work schedule, in order to terminate his cooperation with federal authorities. It was a kill order. She stood and held the page and breathed, and the room was very quiet. "He signed it," she said. "He always signed things," Roman said. He believed in records. He thought records meant control. His voice was rough. "Marcus doesn't sign things. That's what I realized after my father died." Marcus understood that records are liabilities. She put the page down carefully. She turned to look at him. "You kept this for 8 years, she said. "Yes, and you didn't give it to anyone." "No, why not?" He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and she could see the full weight of it on him, 8 years of a secret that had shaped every decision he'd made, including her. "Because I didn't know if it would be enough," he said. "And because giving it over meant taking down everything my father built, and I wasn't," he stopped. Started again. "I wasn't ready, and now? Marcus knows you're asking questions," he said. "If he decides you're a liability, the evidence doesn't protect you. Nothing I say to him protects you. The only thing that protects you is this." He gestured at the room around them. "Being in the right hands before he realizes what I'm doing." "And your hands aren't the right hands," she said. "No," he said. "They're not." She looked at him, at his face in the lamplight, tired and honest, in the way that comes after a person has stopped trying to manage the impression they're making. She thought about the 22-year-old in the photograph, outside the diner, about the parking structure, about all the years between then and the fundraiser where they'd met, and what those years had been for him. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Okay, when you found me. At the fundraiser. Was any of it real?" He held her gaze without flinching. "All of it," he said. "That's the honest answer, and I know it doesn't help." "It doesn't," she said. "I know." She reached into her coat pocket and took out her phone. She needed to call Claire. That was the next step. Call Claire. Tell her they were inside. Give her the room number. Get the documentation out before Marcus's shift change ended and his people came back. She was unlocking her phone when she heard it. Below them, the loading dock door. Not a key. The sound of something being applied to a lock that doesn't yield to keys. A specific metallic working sound she couldn't name, but Roman could. because she saw his face change completely in the second he heard it. "That's not the shift change," he said. He said it very quietly and very precisely, like a man delivering a fact in a situation where facts are the only useful currency. "Marcus," she said. "He must have—" Roman looked at the folder she'd been holding, at the signed kill order, at the 8 years of evidence stacked in boxes around them. "He must have had this location wired, a sensor on the secondary door." "I didn't know." She was already at the inner door, her hand on the lock. "Is there another way out?" she said. "Second floor window on the east wall," he said. 12 feet to the ground. "Can you open it?" "Yes." They moved. Roman killed the banker's lamp. The room went dark, but not completely. The flashlight in his hand pointed at the floor, enough to navigate. He led her out of the inner room and across the second-level floor toward the east wall, and she heard, below them, the loading dock door open, heard voices, 2 of them. Maybe 3 heard, the particular sound of men moving through a space with a specific purpose. The east window was industrial casement, old, the kind that swings outward on a pivot. Roman forced it open with his shoulder, a crack of resistance, and then it gave. Cold air pushed in. Below, a concrete ledge, maybe 3 feet wide, running along the building's exterior. And below that, the ground. "Go," he said. "I'm calling someone first," she said. Vivian, 30 seconds. She dialed Dagclair's number, and it connected in 2 rings, and she said, "We're inside. Second level. They're in the building." She gave the address confirmation. "The evidence is in a room off the second level, northwest corner. There's a signed kill order. Carlo Vescari. Come now." "We're already outside," Claire said. 2 minutes. She ended the call. From the staircase, footsteps. Not hurrying. The measured pace of men who know where they're going. Roman looked at her. In the dark, with the cold coming through the open window, his face was stripped of everything but what was actually there. No management, no calculation. Just a man who understood precisely what was about to happen. "Evidence," she said. "The kill order. We can't leave it." He went back to the inner room. She heard him moving fast. She stayed at the window and watched the top of the staircase, and the footsteps got louder, and then a flashlight beam swung up onto the second level, and she pressed herself against the wall. Roman came back with the folder, just the kill order, and the 3 documents underneath it, the most critical of everything, and he pressed them into her hands. "Go out the window," he said. "And you, I'll follow." She looked at him. "I'll follow," he said again. "I need 30 seconds. She didn't believe him, and she didn't have a choice. She went through the window. The concrete ledge was slick condensation on the surface, cold underfoot. She kept her back to the wall and moved toward the building's corner. The folder held tight against her chest, the cold coming off the concrete through her coat. Below her voices, she looked down and saw the black sedan from the delivery bay, and 2 men standing near it, looking up. They'd seen her. She heard one of them shout something, and she moved faster along the ledge, and reached the corner and looked down 12 feet, the concrete below, a dumpster pushed against the wall, at an angle that might help or might not. She heard from inside the building a single sharp sound that was not a door slamming. She stopped. She pressed herself against the corner of the building, and she held still, and she listened. And from inside the window she'd come through. There was nothing, no movement, no second set of footsteps preparing to follow, no Roman. Below her, the 2 men from the sedan had moved to the building's side, and one of them was pointing at the ledge, and the other was already heading toward the door. She looked at the window. She looked at the folder in her hands. She looked at the ground, 12 feet below. Marcus Vescari's voice came through the open window column, carrying easily in the cold air, the voice of a man in a building he controls, addressing another person in a way that makes the power differential unmistakable. "Did you really think," Marcus said, "that I didn't know about this room?" And Roman said nothing. And Vivian understood, in that instant, pressed against the outside wall of the warehouse in the October dark with her father's kill order in her hands, and the ground 12 feet below, that the choice Roman had made by staying behind was not the choice of a man who believed he was going to follow her out the window. It was the choice of a man who understood that someone had to stay, and that it couldn't be her. She dropped from the ledge. The impact went through her ankles, her knees, the breath punching out of her chest as she hit and rolled on the cold concrete, and she was on her feet before the pain had fully registered, and she was running, the folder locked against her chest, heading for the chain-link gate at the rail yard perimeter, and behind her she heard shouting, and ahead of her she saw headlights, two vehicles, moving fast, coming from the north end of the block. Not Marcus's vehicles. She ran toward them anyway because she had no other direction, and the folder was in her hands. And Claire had said 2 minutes, and it had been 2 minutes, and she was not her father, and she was not going to end up on the wrong side of a calculation she hadn't made herself. The first vehicle stopped 10 feet from her, and the door opened and Claire stepped out with 2 other people, and Vivian stopped running and stood on the concrete and breathed. "He's inside," Vivian said. "Roman and Marcus. And the evidence, most of it, is still up there." Claire took the folder from her hands with gloved fingers and looked at the top sheet for exactly 3 seconds. "Go with Agent Torres," she said, gesturing to one of the people behind her. "Get away from this building." "We'll handle the building," Claire said. She was already moving. "Go." Vivian stood for one more second and looked back at the warehouse and the lit window on the second level, and she thought about a 22-year-old outside a diner with his hand on her father's arm. And she thought about all the years after, and she thought about the choice that had just been made in a room she was no longer in. Then she went with Torres. And behind her the night opened up with the sound of federal agents entering a building, and voices, and somewhere above the rail yard, the first gray suggestion of a dawn that was going to arrive whether anyone was ready for it or not. Torres put her in the back of a black SUV, with the heat running and the doors locked, and drove 2 blocks north before pulling over and getting on his radio. Vivian sat in the back seat, with her hands in her lap and her ankles throbbing from the drop, and listened to his clipped, technical language and tried to parse what was happening behind her in the building she'd just left. She couldn't. The radio traffic was coded and fast, and Torres kept his body angled away from her in the front seat, like he was used to having people in the back who weren't supposed to hear things. "Is he alive?" she said. Torres glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Roman Vescari," she said. "Is he alive? We don't have a status update yet, ma'am." "Don't ma'am me," she said. "Is he alive?" Torres put the radio down and turned partway in his seat. He was maybe 35, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had learned to stay neutral under pressure, and was doing so now, but not perfectly. "We have agents inside," he said. "That's all I can tell you right now." She looked out the window at the warehouse building 2 blocks south. From here, she could see the second-level window she'd come through, still open, and the thin rectangle of light beyond it that meant the power was back on up there, which meant people were moving through the space. She watched the window and breathed through her nose and felt the pain in her ankles settle from sharp to a deep, insistent pulse. Her phone rang. Danny. She declined it. Danny called again immediately. She picked up. "I've been watching the clock," Danny said. "It's been 40 minutes. "I'm okay," Vivian said. "I'm in a car. Federal agents." A silence. Vivian. "I'm okay," she said again. "I'll call you when I know more." She ended the call. Torres's radio crackled, and he turned away from her again, and she heard, through the coded language, a phrase that wasn't coded at all. One civilian. Second level. Medical needed, and she had the door open before she'd consciously decided to open it. Torres said something sharp behind her, but she was already out and moving, and the cold hit her like a physical thing, the night air coming off the rail yard with genuine force, and she walked fast toward the warehouse entrance, her ankles registering every step, because one civilian, second level, medical needed meant Roman was up there, and he was alive enough to need medical, which meant he was not dead, and everything else could be determined once she knew that. A federal agent at the warehouse entrance stepped into her path with his hand up. "Ma'am, I'm Vivian Cross," she said. "I have a cooperation agreement with Claire." The prosecutor. "Call her right now and tell her I'm at the entrance." The agent looked at her and then at Torres, who had jogged up behind her, slightly out of breath. "She's cleared," Torres said, with the tone of a man surrendering a position he hadn't wanted to hold anyway. They let her through. The interior of the warehouse was organized chaos agents moving between shelving units with evidence bags, flashlights, equipment cases. The whole mechanical process of a federal operation in its early stages, everyone purposeful and none of it calm. She went straight to the steel staircase. Someone said her name and she kept moving. The second level was brighter than she'd left it. They'd brought portable lighting 2 stands, blazing white, flooding the space in the harsh flat light that makes everything look clinical and slightly unreal. Claire was standing near the inner room door with a tablet in her hand and a phone at her ear, and she looked at Vivian, when Vivian came off the top of the stairs, and her expression did something that wasn't quite warning and wasn't quite permission. She stepped aside. Roman was on the floor of the inner room. 2 paramedics were with him, moving fast and economical. He was on his back with his jacket open and his shirt cut from collar to hem, and there was blood more than Vivian had prepared herself for. A dark spreading stain across the left side of his torso from somewhere below the ribs, and his face was the color of old concrete, and his eyes were closed. She went to him and crouched down, and one of the paramedics said, "Ma'am," and she said, "I'm with him," without looking up. She put her hand on his face. His cheek was cold. "Roman," she said. His eyes didn't open. "He's lost significant blood," the paramedic said, not unkindly. "We're stabilizing before transport. You need to step back." She stepped back. She stood in the doorway of the inner room and watched them work, and felt the cold concrete floor through her shoes, and looked at his face and thought, with a clarity that was almost physical, he stayed. He had stayed in the room with Marcus Vescari and whatever Marcus had brought with him, and he had stayed on purpose, buying her time to get off the ledge and across the rail yard, and to Claire's people, and whatever Marcus had done to him in that room was the cost of those extra minutes. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she turned around, because she needed to know where Marcus Vescari was. Claire was off her phone when Vivian came back out. "Where is he?" Vivian said. "Being processed," Claire said. "We have him. 3 others. 2 of them are already cooperating." "Already. Marcus Vescari runs an organization built on mutual fear," Claire said. "When the center doesn't hold, the perimeter folds fast." She looked at Vivian steadily. "Roman, what you saw in there, he's going to make it. The paramedics say the wound is serious, but not fatal if they move fast, which they are." Vivian let that land. Let it settle into the part of her that had been running on compressed air since the drop off the ledge. "The kill order," she said. "The folder I gave you." "In evidence," Claire said. "With photographs and chain of custody from your hands to mine. Solid. And the boxes in this room. We'll be processing them for weeks," Claire said. "But from a first look, this is what we needed." Roman kept everything. She said it with a quality Vivian couldn't entirely name. Not admiration exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a decision made over years that had its own moral weight regardless of what surrounded it. Vivian looked at the boxes stacked on 2 walls. 8 years of a man carrying something he couldn't put down and couldn't hand over and couldn't destroy. 8 years of living with the decision he'd made at 22 and everything it had cost, including her. She thought about her father, about the signed order in the folder, about the words terminate his cooperation, her father's cooperation with the very investigators who were now standing in a warehouse documenting the evidence her father had died for gathering. 11 years. It had taken 11 years for the thing to close the loop. "What happens now?" Vivian said. "Tonight, Roman goes to the hospital under federal protective custody," Claire said. "Marcus Vescari goes into processing and then pretrial detention. We'll be in touch about your formal statement. We'll want that in the next 48 hours while it's fresh." She paused. "The cooperation agreement protects your evidence from being challenged. It also protects you from any civil liability arising from how you obtained it." "And Roman," Vivian said. Claire looked at her for a moment. "That's a more complicated conversation." "I know," Vivian said. "I'm not asking you to protect him. I asked what happens." "He witnessed your father's death and failed to report it," Claire said. "He has 11 years of criminal organization evidence that he held and didn't provide to authorities. Those are both serious." She paused. "They're also the kinds of serious that a federal prosecutor can balance against extraordinary cooperation, depending on what Roman chooses to do from this point forward." "You want him to testify," Vivian said. "I want him to do what he came to this warehouse tonight to do," Claire said. "Give all of this up." Vivian looked at the door of the inner room. Paramedics were moving now, a stretcher coming up the staircase, the mechanics of transport. She watched them work. "Let me talk to him," she said. "Before the hospital. 2 minutes." Claire looked at her for a long moment. 2 minutes? She said. They let her crouch beside the stretcher before they moved it. His eyes were open now. That was the first thing. He'd come back from wherever the blood loss had taken him. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. His eyes found her face and stayed there. She was not going to cry. She had decided that. "Hey," she said. His mouth moved. No sound came out. Don't, she said. Save it. She put her hand on his, carefully, away from the IV line the paramedics had placed. You need to listen. Can you do that? His eyes said yes. They have Marcus, she said. They have the evidence. All of it, she watched his face. You need to cooperate with them. Full cooperation. Everything you know, do you understand? His fingers moved under her hand.
I know what that means for you, she said.
I know what it costs. She kept her voice flat and clear because she needed him to hear the words and not the feeling behind them. But you've been carrying this for 8 years, and it needs to come down. All the way down. She paused. My father was trying to do the right thing. He cooperated. He told the truth, and it got him killed, and the case went nowhere. She looked at Roman's eyes and held them. I need it to go somewhere this time. I need there to be a record. A real one. That says what was done and who ordered it, and that my father's death was not an accident. Roman's hand turned over slowly under hers. His fingers closed around her hand with the faint pressure of someone working at the edge of what they have left. I'm not forgiving you, she said quietly. That's not what this is. I just need you to finish it. Whatever you were trying to do by keeping all of this, finish it. His eyes were wet. She didn't look away from them. Okay, she said. Okay. She let go of his hand and stood up and stepped back, and the paramedics moved and she watched them take him toward the stairs. She stood in the empty inner room after they were gone, empty of people, still full of boxes. The banker's lamp back on, because someone had plugged it into a portable power strip. Its amber light incongruous in the middle of all the blazing white from the portable stands outside the door. She stood and looked at the boxes and thought about her father. Not abstractly. Specifically the particular way he had of doing two things at once always. How he'd read the paper with the TV on in the background, and claim he was following both, the broken zipper on her blue coat that he was always saying he'd fix and never did. His voice on Sunday mornings, when he made eggs and called her down to eat, that specific sound of it, which she hadn't been able to fully reconstruct in memory for years, only to realize now, standing in this room, that she could. She stood there long enough for that. Then she walked out. The night outside the warehouse had changed in the hours she'd been inside. More vehicles. More personnel. The rail yard side was lit up now, portable floods turning the concrete white, and the organized chaos she'd walked into had settled into organized procedure, which was quieter and in some ways harder to be present for. Torres found her at the perimeter. Miss Cross, we can take you wherever you need to go. Danny's, she said. She gave him the address. He drove her without conversation, which she was grateful for. She sat in the back seat and watched Chicago move past the window, the south side giving way to the north side, the industrial blocks softening into residential, the city doing what cities do at midnight, which is continue, indifferent and enormous and alive. Her phone had 14 notifications. She looked at none of them. She was thinking about Marcus Vescari. Not with fear, not anymore. The fear had done its job and was releasing now, leaving behind the particular emptiness that follows sustained adrenaline, the exhaustion that feels like something has been wrung out of you. She was thinking about him with something colder and more deliberate. About his hand on her arm at the rehearsal dinner. The half-sec too long. The way he'd looked at her across the table and delivered a message without words. He had known for days. He had known she was asking questions, and he had let her look, let her move through the city, let her stand outside that warehouse, because he was watching, because he was waiting to see how far it would go and what she'd actually find, because if she found nothing on her own, then there was no problem, and if she found something, then he could address it before it reached anyone who mattered. And he had addressed it. In a second-floor room with Roman Vescari, and whatever it was he'd used that had put Roman on a stretcher. She thought about all of that with the particular clarity that comes after fear has left a person, the cold, structural clarity of a building after the wind has passed, when you can see exactly where the load was and whether the walls held. They had held, barely and not without cost, but they had held. Torres pulled up in front of Danny's building, and she got out and thanked him. And he said someone would be in contact tomorrow, which was Saturday, which was her wedding day, and she said fine and went inside. Danny opened the door before she knocked. She looked at Vivian in the hallway for a moment and then pulled her inside and did not ask a single question, which was the second greatest act of friendship Vivian had ever received. She sat on Danny's couch in a borrowed sweater, with a cup of something warm that she held without drinking, and at some point, Danny turned the lamp down and sat in the chair across from her and just stayed. And the apartment was quiet, except for the city outside, and the particular domestic sounds of a place where someone lives, the refrigerator cycling, a car alarm briefly and then not, a neighbor somewhere above them moving through their night. Vivian sat in that quiet and let herself be tired. Not collapsed. Not undone. Just tired, the genuine earned tiredness of a person who had held themselves together through something that required it, and was now in a place where it was safe to let the holding be visible. She thought about the wedding dress in the garment bag at the house on Wolverton Street. She thought about the 40 people who would receive calls tomorrow morning, explaining that the event had been postponed, which was the word she'd already decided on. Not canceled, not because the word wasn't accurate, but because canceled felt like a verdict, and this was more complicated than a verdict. She thought about her father. She kept returning to him, the way you return to a room after you've been told you can finally go in. He had been trying to do the right thing. He had cooperated with investigators who were building a case against people who had resources and reach and a specific philosophy about the cost of opposition. He had made that decision knowing, probably, what the risk was, because her father was not a naive man. He had made it anyway, because he was the kind of person who decided that his conscience had operational authority over his survival instinct, and he had paid for that decision with his life, and the case had died with him. Until tonight. Until an envelope on a desk in a locked study, left by someone, and she still didn't know who, she realized. She hadn't asked, and there was a possibility she never would, and pushed her into the machinery of it. She thought about whether it mattered who had left it. The note in that dark dried ink, "Ask Roman why your father really died." Someone in the Vescari organization who had known. Someone who had watched the situation building and decided, with the wedding approaching and the moment narrowing, to give her the information she needed to ask the right question. Maybe she'd never know. Maybe that was fine. The action had consequences that the actor couldn't have fully predicted, and those consequences had led to a second-floor room full of 8 years of evidence, and a signed kill order, and a federal prosecutor in gloves looking at Carlo Vescari's signature at the bottom of a typed instruction to have her father killed. That was enough. That would have to be enough. She set down the cup and lay back on the couch and pulled the blanket Danny had left there over herself and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow was supposed to be her wedding day. She thought about that with the full weight she'd been keeping compressed for the last 72 hours. The dress, the flowers, the 40 people, Roman's speech at the rehearsal dinner that she still thought was genuine, the ring on her finger that she still hadn't taken off. She looked at it in the dim light from the window. A clean, well-made thing, chosen carefully, meaning what it had been put on her hand to mean. She took it off. She set it on the end table beside the couch. She looked at it there for a moment. Then she closed her eyes. She was awake before 6. Danny's apartment was gray with early light, and the city outside had the specific quiet of a Saturday morning, that brief window when Chicago hasn't fully committed to being awake yet. She sat up and checked her phone. Claire had sent a text at 4:17. In the morning, Marcus Vescari in federal custody. Charged. Roman Vescari in surgery stable. Call me when you're up. She called at 6:03. Surgery went well, Claire said without preamble. He's in recovery. The wound was from a knife. Marcus brought 2 men, and one of them had a knife, and apparently there was a confrontation before we arrived that we're still piecing together from the physical evidence. Roman fought them, Vivian said. It appears so, Claire said. He was alone in that room with 3 men, and he didn't have a weapon, and he's alive. So, she left the rest of that sentence where it was. He's asking to speak with his attorney. That's good. It means he's thinking. His attorney is someone we know, which is also good. She'll tell him to cooperate fully, and I believe he will. What happens to him, Vivian said. That's going to take time to determine, Claire said. Witness to a homicide he failed to report 11 years ago. Ongoing knowledge of criminal enterprise activity. Weighed against 8 years of evidence preservation that just broke this case open, and a level of cooperation that, if it holds, will lead to prosecutions we've been trying to make for over a decade. A pause. I won't make you a promise I can't keep, but I'll tell you that the calculus is not simple, and the people making the decision are not unreasonable. Okay, Vivian said. Your formal statement? Are you able to come in today? She looked at the ring on the end table, at the gray light through Danny's window, at the city waking up outside. Yes, she said. What time? 10 o'clock. I'll send you the address. Okay. She ended the call and sat for a moment, and then got up and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because there were things that needed to be done today, and some of them were going to be hard, and all of them required her to be fully present. And the kettle was a place to start. Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway in pajamas, her hair sideways from sleep, and looked at Vivian with an expression that contained the entire weight of a friendship of 12 years compressed into a single look. Coffee, Danny said. Kettle's on, Vivian said. Danny came and stood beside her at the counter. They looked out the kitchen window at the street below, at a city that was starting to move, that was carrying on with the ordinary business of a Saturday morning, with complete indifference to everything that had happened in a warehouse on the south side 6 hours ago. The wedding, Danny said. I know, Vivian said. What do you need me to do? Thought about it. The calls that needed to be made. The venue that needed to be notified. The caterer, the florist, the 40 people. Roman's people, who were Romans to deal with if and when he was able. I need you to help me make a list, she said. And then I need to give a statement to a federal prosecutor at 10 o'clock, and I need you to drive me there. Okay, Danny said. And I need coffee first. Obviously, Danny said, and reached past her for the mugs. They stood in the kitchen, in the gray Saturday morning light, and the kettle built to its boil. And Vivian looked at the street below, and thought about her father, and thought about Roman in a hospital bed, in federal custody, and thought about Marcus. Vescary's hand on her arm at the rehearsal dinner, that half-second too long, the measurement of what he'd thought he held over her. He had been wrong about what she was. He had looked at her and seen a liability. A woman who'd gotten too close to information she wasn't supposed to have. A problem to be managed the way the Viscaris managed problems, efficiently and without record. He had not seen what she actually was. What she actually was had handed a federal prosecutor a signed kill order at midnight and walked away from a 12-foot drop on a cold concrete ledge and sat in a federal building at 10 in the morning on what was supposed to be her wedding day and told the truth with the precision and completeness of someone who had been building toward this moment, in some form for 11 years without knowing it. Her father had cooperated and been silenced. She had cooperated and the case was made. That wasn't justice. It was too late and too costly and too full of things that couldn't be recovered for the word justice to sit cleanly on it. But it was something. It was the record her father had died trying to create, finally existing, finally attached to names and signatures and dates that would go into a proceeding with consequences. Kettle boiled. She poured. She handed Danny a mug and picked up her own and turned away from the window. She had a statement to give and calls to make, and a life to begin the process of understanding without the architecture that had been built around her for 2 years, and the morning was going to require all of her, which was fine. She had always been better when she was required to be fully present. She drank her coffee and did not look at the ring on the end table and thought, whatever comes next, it starts today, and she was the one deciding what it is. The federal building on South Dearborn was the kind of place designed to make you feel the weight of the institution before you said a single word inside it. The lobby ceiling was too high. The floors were a marble that had been walked on long enough to lose its shine, but not its coldness. Security was professional and impersonal in equal measure, which was fine. Vivian didn't need warmth from the architecture. She needed it to hold still while she did what she'd come to do. Claire met her at the elevator on the 4th floor at 10:02. She had a different suit on from the night before, but the same leather portfolio and the same precise assessing quality in her eyes. She looked at Vivian the way a person looks at something they weren't entirely sure would show up and are recalibrating around now that it has. You look like you slept, Claire said. 4 hours, Vivian said. It was enough. They went into a conference room that had a window looking out at another building's brick wall and a table with a recorder on it, and 2 other people Vivian hadn't met, a junior prosecutor named Holt, who took notes by hand without looking at what he was writing, and a woman named Solis from the FBI's Organized Crime Division, who had been working the Vescari case for 3 years, and looked at Vivian with the particular attention of someone seeing a piece of a puzzle they'd been missing finally appear. The statement took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Vivian had expected it to be procedural chronological, document by document, a recitation of what she'd found and when and how. It was that. But it was also something else. The questions Claire and Solus asked pulled her through the architecture of everything she'd discovered, not as a sequence of events, but as a system of relationships, each piece connected to others in ways she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. By the end, she felt wrung out in a way that was different from exhaustion. It was the feeling of having been turned inside out and put back correctly. Everything that had been compressed and compartmentalized for 72 hours finally allowed to exist in its full shape. When it was over, Claire walked her back to the elevator. The signed kill order goes into evidence in the Carlo Vescari file, Claire said. Carlo is dead, which limits what we can prosecute directly. But the documentation of his actions becomes part of the record in the Marcus Vescari case, which means your father's name, and what was done to him will be in the official proceedings. On the record, Vivian said. On the record, Claire confirmed. Permanently, Vivian pressed the elevator button and looked at the floor for a moment. The person who left the envelope in Roman's study. The one with my name on it. Do you know who it was? Claire was quiet for a beat. We have a reasonable idea. There was a man in the Vescari organization low level, primarily logistics, who had worked alongside your father in the months before his death. He's been cooperating with us intermittently for 2 years. We believe he decided the wedding was the last window. Why the wedding? Because after you married Roman, you became family, Claire said. And in that organization, family complicates everything. He wanted you to know before you were inside the circle in a way that made knowing dangerous for you. Vivian thought about that. About a man she'd never met deciding that she deserved the truth at the last possible moment before it became too costly to give her. Is he okay? She said. He's in protective custody, Claire said. He'll be fine. The elevator opened. Vivian stepped in. She turned around and looked at Claire. Thank you, she said. You did the work, Claire said. I just had the warrant authority. The doors closed. Danny was in the lobby with 2 coffees, and the expression of someone who had been sitting with their own anxiety for 3 hours and was managing it by buying hot beverages. She handed one to Vivian without speaking. They walked out onto South Dearborn and turned north and walked for a block before either of them said anything. Well, Danny said. It's done, Vivian said the statement. The evidence. It's all in Roman, in federal custody. Cooperating, I think. His attorney will tell him to. Danny was quiet for half a block, and you. Vivian held the coffee in both hands and felt the warmth of it through the cup and looked at the street ahead of them. An ordinary Saturday in Chicago. Dante took it, people moving through their ordinary Saturday lives with the complete unself-consciousness of people who hadn't spent the last 3 days dismantling the architecture of everything they thought they were building toward. I'm going to the house, she said. I need to get some things. I'll come. No, Vivian said, I need to do that part alone. Danny looked at her sidelong and then nodded, the nod of someone who understands which things need to be witnessed and which things need privacy. Call me when you're done, she said. I will. The house on Wolverton Street was quiet in the way that houses go quiet when their primary tension has left them. Vivian let herself in with her key and stood in the front hallway and listened to the absence of Roman in the space no keys on the hook, no particular weight to the air that he sometimes left behind him when he'd been home recently. Just a house, expensive and well-appointed, and emptied of the thing that had made it feel inhabited. She went upstairs first. The wedding dress was still in the garment bag in the walk-in closet, where she'd left it 3 days ago and a lifetime ago. She unzipped the bag and looked at it for a long moment. Ivory silk, clean lines, the kind of dress that doesn't shout but accumulates, and thought about the woman who had chosen it and what that woman had believed she was choosing it for. She zipped the bag back up. She was not going to be dramatic about it. She would return it or sell it or donate it, and each of those options was practical, and none of them was what it felt like standing in this closet, but that was fine. The feeling and the practicality could coexist without either one winning. She packed 2 bags, not chaotically carefully, the way she did everything she could control. Clothes for 2 weeks, toiletries, her laptop, the external hard drive where she kept her work files, the folder of her own documents that she kept in the nightstand, passport, the small envelope of photographs she kept in the same drawer, old ones from childhood, her mother and father in the kitchen of the house she'd grown up in, her father with his hand on her mother's shoulder, both of them looking at something outside the frame of the photograph, both of them squinting against what must have been morning light. She held that photograph for a moment before putting it in her bag. She went downstairs and into the study. The filing cabinet was still as Roman had left it, some drawers open, some folders missing. She didn't touch it. It was federal property now, in a practical sense, even if the physical transfer of custody hadn't happened yet. Someone would come and take the rest of it, and document it with the same careful process that had turned the contents of the second-floor warehouse room into evidence boxes with numbered labels. She stood in the study and looked at the desk where the envelope had been. Clear wood surface. Nothing on it now but a pen holder and a charger cable for a phone that was currently in an evidence bag somewhere on the south side. She thought about the blood-stained envelope with her name on it, about picking it up for the first time, about the way the room had gone quiet. She thought about all the things that envelope had set in motion, and all the things that would have continued not moving if she'd found it, and put it back and gone to bed, and married Roman Vescari on Saturday morning in an ivory dress. She wouldn't have. She knew that now with the hindsight of 3 days. Somewhere in her, before the envelope, she had been feeling the looseness of things, the small inconsistencies, the questions she hadn't let herself fully form. The envelope hadn't created her doubt. It had given her doubt a shape to move toward. She turned off the study light and walked out and closed the door behind her. 3 months is a particular unit of time. Long enough for the immediate to become the recent. Long enough for the emergency to become the circumstance. Not long enough for the circumstance to become the past, but that wasn't what Vivian was aiming for. She was not trying to put the last year behind her. She was trying to understand what she was going to build out of the material it had left her. She had gone back to work 2 weeks after the statement. Her firm had been careful with her in the way that colleagues are careful when they know something significant has happened, but not exactly what extra consideration, slightly softened edges on the usual expectations. She had been grateful for the work itself, for the specific pleasure of structural problems that had answers determinable by math and physics and the load-bearing properties of materials. Problems that didn't require her to assess the interior architecture of another person's choices. She was good at her job. She'd always known that. She was finding now, working the way she'd worked in her 20s, before Romanfully, without the soft partition she'd unconsciously maintained between her professional life and the life she was supposed to be building with him, that she was better at it than she'd let herself be in 2 years. That was something. The Vescari proceedings moved with the particular grinding momentum of federal cases, comprehensive, well-resourced, and slow. Claire kept her updated with the precision of someone who understood that Vivian needed information to function, not comfort. Marcus Vescari was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, racketeering, and 4 counts of evidence tampering. He pled not guilty on all counts, and his bail was denied on the basis of flight risk. His trial date was set for the following spring. 3 of his 4 lieutenants pled guilty in exchange for cooperation agreements and reduced sentences. The 4th went to trial on separate charges and lost. The organization itself, the physical infrastructure of it, the properties and accounts and layered corporate structures that Carlo Vescari had spent 30 years building, was dismantled by federal forfeiture proceedings over the course of the winter. Some of it was sold. Some of it was absorbed into civic use. The Meridian building on West Jackson was purchased by a development group and repurposed into mixed-income housing, which Vivian found out from a real estate industry newsletter and read about twice before putting her phone down and making herself a sandwich, because she didn't know what to do with that information, and the sandwich needed making. Roman's case was the complicated one. She had known it would be. Claire had told her from the beginning that the calculus was not simple, and it wasn't. The charging decisions took 11 weeks from the night of the warehouse. In the end, he was charged with misprision of a felony knowing of a crime and failing to report it, and with criminal conspiracy for the 3 years between when he'd taken over nominal control of the Vescari organization from his uncle, and when he'd been arrested. He was not charged as a principal in his father's crimes, because the evidence supported a different picture, a young man made complicit in something he couldn't stop, who had then spent 8 years quietly building, a case he didn't know how to bring forward. His cooperation was complete. Claire told her that in one of their update calls, with a flatness that conveyed it was worth noting. He gave us everything, Claire said, not just the warehouse. Names, dates, financial structures going back 20 years. 2 cases we'd closed as unsolvable were reopened based on his testimony. A pause. He also gave a formal accounting of your father's death on the record that corroborated the kill order and identified both men who were present in the parking structure. One of them died in 2019. The other is being charged. Vivian was at her kitchen table when she took that call. New kitchen table in the apartment she'd found in Lincoln Square. In the first weeks after everything, a third-floor unit with south-facing windows and radiators that knocked in the cold, and no history of anyone she'd loved living inside its walls. The other one is being charged, she repeated. Yes. With my father's murder, yes. She sat with that for a long moment. Outside her south-facing window, the December sky was the particular flat white of a Chicago winter afternoon, the light without warmth, but also without darkness, just an even illumination of everything it touched. Okay, she said. The sentencing recommendation for Roman, Claire continued, will take into account the cooperation and the circumstances of his original involvement. I'm not making you a promise, but the picture's different than it was in October. I understand, Vivian said. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a while without moving. She thought about the sentencing recommendation and what different meant in practice and whether she had any feelings about it that she was prepared to name. She did. They were complicated and she didn't try to simplify them. She thought about Roman at 22 in the parking structure on West Jackson, watching something happen that he couldn't stop and didn't stop, and had been trying to answer for ever since. She thought about what that had made him over the 20 years after. What accommodations a person makes when they've absorbed something like that into their foundation, how it changes the load-bearing structure of who they are. She thought about whether understanding that made the thing he'd done, to her finding her, building a relationship out of prior knowledge and guilt, and something else she still believed was real better or worse, and she landed, as she usually did when she sat with it long enough, on the answer neither. It made it exactly what it was, a thing too complicated for better or worse. She was not angry at him the way she'd expected to be angry. The anger had been there in the early weeks, clean and clarifying, but it had burned through its fuel relatively fast and left behind something more durable and less convenient, a sadness she respected enough not to try to rush through. She visited her father's grave in January. It was a Tuesday, a work day, and she took the morning off and drove out to the cemetery in Evanston, where her parents were buried side by side. Her mother's stone was cleaner than her father's moss had started at the base of his, which she cleared away with her gloved hands, a task that took longer than she'd expected because the cold had made the growth stubborn. She stood in front of both stones for a while without saying anything, which was what she usually did when she came. She'd never been comfortable with the convention of speaking aloud to the dead. It felt performative, like she was doing it for herself more than for them. She just stood and was present and looked at her father's name and the dates beneath it. David Arthur Cross, 1958-2013. There was now, attached to those dates, an official federal court record, a document that said he had cooperated with federal investigators in the matter of criminal enterprise activity connected to the Vescari organization, and that his death was not an accident, and that the man who had ordered it had been identified, charged, and was awaiting trial. She had asked Claire to send her a copy of the relevant section of the proceedings. She had it in a folder in her apartment. She hadn't decided what to do with it, whether to put it away somewhere, whether to frame it, which felt strange, whether to simply keep it as the document it was. For now she had it in the folder, and that was enough. What she wanted, and this was the thing she'd been trying to articulate for months without quite landing on it, wasn't for her father's death to have been worth it. Nothing was worth that. She didn't want meaning attached to it, or purpose, or the consoling narrative of sacrifice. She just wanted it counted. She wanted the record to say that David Cross had made a choice, and the choice had cost him everything, and the people who had made it cost him everything had names, and were being held responsible for those names. She wanted it in the record. It was in the record. She stood at the grave a while longer, and then she said aloud, for the first time, breaking her own convention, "It's in the record, Dad." She said it quietly, the way she'd say something across a table, to someone sitting close enough that it didn't need volume. "You're in it." Then she went back to her car and drove to work. The letter from Roman came in February. Not an email. An actual letter, handwritten, on plain paper, mailed from the address of what she assumed was either a federal holding facility or supervised release. She didn't know enough about the timing of his case to be certain. The envelope had no return address, but the postmark was Chicago. She sat with it unopened on her kitchen table for 2 days before she read it. She had asked herself in the months since October whether she wanted to hear from him. She'd concluded that she didn't know, which was its own kind of answer. She wasn't avoiding it. She was simply unable to determine with the clarity she preferred to bring to decisions what she wanted the communication to be or to cost her. She opened it on a Thursday evening after work, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the lamp on and the radiator knocking. It was 3 pages. His handwriting was smaller than she'd expected. She'd seen his signature on documents, but never his longhand, and it was compact and slightly leftward leaning, the handwriting of someone who'd learned it formally and then modified it over years into something more efficient. She read it straight through without stopping. He did not ask for forgiveness. That was the first thing she noticed, and the thing that kept her reading through the 3-page part when part of her had been ready to stop. He said he understood, from conversations with his attorney and from the structure of his own thinking over the months since the warehouse, that asking for forgiveness was not an appropriate request to make of her under the circumstances. He was not going to make it. What he said instead was factual, which she could receive. He described what he had done and what it had cost her. He described his father's organization and his own position within it, not as mitigation but as context, as the architecture of how a person ends up in a particular place and making particular choices. He described the night at the parking structure with a directness that cost something to read because it was fully present in the detail of it. The cold, the sound, the specific quality of his own stillness as he stood on the second level and understood what he was watching and did not move. He had not been able to move. He had been 22, and he had been his father's son, in a way he'd spent every year since trying to not be. And he had stood there, and his body had locked, and his father's voice had been in his head, telling him that what he was watching was the consequence of a choice David Cross had made freely, and he had believed that voice long enough that it became too late. He wrote, "I have tried, for 11 years, to make something out of that moment that wasn't just the worst thing I've ever done. I made you. I built a relationship out of guilt and something else that was real, and the problem with that construction is that the guilt was load-bearing, and you deserved a foundation that had nothing to do with what I owed you." She read that sentence twice. She put the letter down and looked at the wall for a while, and then picked it up again. The last page was shorter. He said he was cooperating fully and would continue to cooperate with everything the federal case required. He said the organization was gone, and he had no interest in what replaced it. He said his attorney believed, given the cooperation and the circumstances, that he would not serve more than 18 months and might serve less. He said he was not telling her that so she would feel better about the situation. He was telling her because she deserved to have information about what was happening rather than having to search for it. At the bottom of the last page, after the date and his name, he had written one more line. "Your father was a better man than my family deserved to reckon with. I'm sorry it took 11 years for the record to say so." She folded the letter. She held it for a moment. Then she put it in the folder with the court document, the one that said David Cross had been counted, and she set the folder on the shelf above her desk, where she kept the things she needed to not lose. She did not write back. Not yet, maybe not ever. She genuinely didn't know, and she had stopped pressuring herself to know things before she was ready to know them. That was one of the things the last 4 months had given her, an altered relationship with the expectation of resolution. Some things resolved cleanly. Some things just became part of the structure you carry, and you learn the weight of them and you adjust, and eventually you stop noticing the adjustment because it's just how you stand now. She drove out of Chicago on a Sunday in March. Not forever. She was coming back. Her job was here. Her apartment was here. Danny was here. The folder on her shelf was here. She was driving out for a week to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a place she'd been once in her 20s and had always meant to go back to, and hadn't because there had always been something preventing it, which she now understood was partly circumstance and partly herself. She left early enough to miss the Sunday morning traffic, and the city came apart around her as she drove north. The density thinning, the architecture simplifying, The particular urban pressure that she'd lived inside for 15 years gradually releasing as the highway cleared and the landscape opened. She thought about very little for the first 2 hours, which was unusual for her. Normally she thought continuously while driving, processed, planned, organized, cross-referenced. Today there was less of that. She drove and watched the road and listened to the sound of the car and let the thinking happen at whatever rate it chose. She thought, at some point, in the second hour, about who she was going to be from here. Not in the ambitious sense, not the 5-year plan version. Just the immediate, practical sense. What kind of person, making what kinds of choices, with what she now knew about the costs of not asking questions and the costs of asking them. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he'd looked in the photograph outside the Meridian building, standing in his security uniform, with that particular expression of a man who has made a decision he intends to honor regardless of the weather. She had that from him, the stubbornness of the thing, the refusal to pretend she didn't know what she knew. She thought about Roman briefly and let herself feel the grief of it, not the anger, not the complicated middle space, just the straightforward grief of something real that had been real and was now something else. That grief was allowed to exist. She wasn't going to cauterize it. She thought about what she was going to do with her work, whether the last 5 months had changed her relationship to it, and in what ways, and she thought it probably had, not in the subject matter, but in the quality of attention she brought to it. She had always been good at seeing the load-bearing structure beneath the visible surface. She was going to be better at that now. She was not sure what to do with that observation, except note it and continue. The Upper Peninsula appeared on the horizon the way it always does gradually, and then completely, the landscape making a declarative statement about itself that you can't argue with or reduce. She stopped at a gas station outside a small town, whose name she'd looked up and then forgot, and bought coffee from a machine that produced something technically coffee-adjacent and stood beside her. Car in the cold March air, and looked at the tree line. The birches were still bare, but the light was different from Chicago light, more horizontal. Somehow, like it arrived at a different angle, like the sky up here had a different relationship with the ground than it did over a city. She drank the terrible coffee and breathed the cold air and felt, with a clarity that she didn't try to catch or keep, that she was not destroyed. She had expected, somewhere in October, that what she'd learned might destroy something fundamental in her ability to trust, or her ability to want things, or her appetite for building a life with another person inside it. She had expected the damage to be architectural. It wasn't. She was altered. She was different than she had been in ways she was still mapping. But the foundation was intact. It had always been intact. She'd built it herself, over years, out of things that didn't depend on anyone else to stay standing. That was something she had known about herself, and had then, during 2 years of loving Roman Vescari, half forgotten, or half allowed herself to forget. Because there's a version of being loved that asks you to need it more than you do. And she had been willing for a while to perform that need, because it felt like what love required. She knew better now, or she knew it again. She'd known it before. She got back in the car. She pulled out of the gas station and back onto the highway heading north, and the tree line moved alongside her, dense and bare and indifferent, in the way of things that have been here a long time, and will continue to be. She was not at the beginning of something. That wasn't the right way to describe it. She was in the middle of something. She had always been in the middle of something. Everyone always is, and the middle had shifted, and she was finding her footing in the new configuration, and it would take as long as it took. She reached the lake in the late afternoon. Lake Superior in March is a particular kind of imposing. The water still cold enough to be dangerous. The ice not entirely gone at the shoreline. The whole expanse of it a flat steel gray under a sky the same color. The horizon line almost invisible between the two. She parked and walked down to the shore, the cold pushing at her coat, and stood at the water's edge. The surface moved without drama, small swells, the water arriving at the rocks, and retreating without any theatricality, just the ongoing work of water against shore, the same thing it had been doing, since before anyone stood here watching it. She reached into her coat pocket. She had brought the engagement ring from the end table in Danny's apartment the morning she'd moved her things from the house on Wolverton Street. Not because she intended to keep it, but because leaving it on Danny's end table felt like making Danny responsible for something that was hers to deal with. She'd carried it in the pocket of various coats for 3 months, the way you carry something you haven't decided about yet. She took it out and held it in her palm. It was still what it had always been, a clean, well-made thing, chosen carefully. Wearing it had meant something to her when she wore it, and that meaning had been real even if its foundation was not what she'd believed. She looked at it for a while. Then she reached into her other coat pocket and took out the other thing she'd brought, a small piece of folded paper, the remains of the invitation she'd burned in the kitchen sink one night in November, the last physical piece of it. One corner with the embossed lettering of her name, Vivian, which she'd found in the sink afterward and kept without being able to articulate why until now. She set the ring on the paper. She looked at both of them together in her palm. She thought about her father and the record. She thought about the letter and the 3 pages of a man trying to be accurate about himself. She thought about her mother and the blue coat with the broken zipper. She thought about Danny in pajamas opening a door at midnight without asking questions. She thought about the spare room and the borrowed sweater and the terrible coffee from a gas station machine, and the way March light arrives at a different angle up here, horizontal and specific and cold. She looked at the water. She didn't throw anything in. That would have been too much, too deliberate, too symbolic, the kind of gesture that announces itself. She folded the paper back up with the ring inside it and put it in her coat pocket, and she stood at the edge of the lake and looked at the water for a long time. At the small ordinary swells and the steel gray color of it and the way the ice held on at the shoreline, not gone yet but going. She would figure out what to do with the ring later. She would figure out a lot of things later. Later was not a failure. Later was the right time for things that needed more of it. The cold was real, and she stayed in it until she'd finished whatever she'd come here to finish, and then she turned away from the water and walked back to the car and got in and started the engine and let the heat build. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking through the windshield at the lake she'd just turned away from, at the gray water and the pale sky and the tree line that had been standing here, doing its uncomplicated work, since long before any of this and would continue long after. Then she put the car in drive. She drove north along the shore road, into the last of the afternoon light, into whatever came next, carrying what she carried, and knowing how now to carry it not lightly, not without cost, but steadily, with both hands and her full attention, the way her father had shown her without knowing he was showing her, by deciding that what he knew mattered more than what it cost him. The road curved away from the lake. The tree line closed around it. The light went long and golden through the bare birches, and then began, as light does, to let go of the day. She drove on. She stopped for the night in a small town called Munising. The motel was the kind of place that had been built in the 1970s and maintained just enough to remain operational without any particular ambition beyond that. A single-story row of rooms facing a parking lot. An office with a neon vacancy sign that flickered on the left side, a vending machine in the breezeway that hummed with the conviction of something that had been running continuously for 20 years and intended to run 20 more. She got a room at the end of the row and carried her bag in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. The wall had a painting on it. Generic, the kind of thing bought by the case for motel rooms, a lake scene, birches, water that was supposed to suggest the region without committing to any specific part of it. Under other circumstances, she might have found it forgettable. Tonight she looked at it for a while, at the flat painted water and the white bark trees, and thought about how someone had made a series of decisions to produce this object, chose the colors, chose the composition, applied paint to canvas with an actual physical brush, and then it had traveled through some chain of commercial transactions to end up on a wall in Munising, Michigan, where a woman from Chicago was looking at it on a Sunday night in March. 3 months after the life she'd planned had come apart in a South Side warehouse. That was the thing about objects. They kept their history underneath, invisible, and nobody asked about it. She showered and changed and found a diner 2 blocks from the motel that was still open at 8 on a Sunday barely, the chairs already up on half the tables, a teenager's sweeping near the back, and she ordered eggs and toast and coffee from a woman named Pat, who had the particular warmth of someone who'd been taking care of strangers in a small town for long enough that it had become genuinely who she was rather than a professional posture. Pat asked where she was from, and she said Chicago, and Pat said she'd been to Chicago once, in 1987. for a conference her husband had attended, and she'd found it very large. "It is large," Vivian agreed. "You up here for the ice caves?" Pat asked. "A little late in the season. They've mostly gone." "Just driving," Vivian said. "Needed to be somewhere different for a while." Pat nodded, as though this were a completely ordinary reason to be in Munising on a Sunday in March, which, in Vivian's experience of small towns near things worth driving to, it probably was. She ate the eggs and drank 2 cups of coffee and left a tip that was larger than the bill and walked back to the motel in the cold. The town was quiet in the way of small places at night. Not empty exactly, but settled. Everything finding its particular resting state for the hours before it needed to be active again. A dog barked once, somewhere on a street she couldn't see. A truck moved slowly through an intersection 2 blocks away, its headlights sweeping across a storefront and then gone. She stood outside her room for a moment before going in. The sky up here was different from the Chicago skyless ambient light, more actual dark, the stars doing work that city skies don't permit them to do. She stood and looked up at them and didn't assign significance to them, because they didn't have any. They were just hydrogen and nuclear physics and enormous distance, but the looking itself was something. It required a certain orientation, a tipping of the head, a willingness to acknowledge scale. She went inside and lay on the motel bed, in the dark, and let her mind move where it wanted without directing it. It went to her father first, as it often did lately, not to the parking structure or the kill order, or any of the machinery of what had been done to him, but to the earlier version. The Sunday morning eggs, the paper and the TV simultaneously. The coat with the broken zipper that he was always going to fix. She let herself stay with those images, because she understood now that they were what she'd been protecting all along. Not the facts of his death, not the record, but the specific texture of who he'd been when he was alive, and hers, and ordinary. She had spent 11 years being careful with those images, keeping them wrapped in something protective, because grief has a way of flattening the people you've lost into the fact of their loss. She had resisted the flattening without knowing that's what she was doing. And now, with the record existing and the case built, and the machinery of accountability moving in its slow federal way, she found she could think about him more directly, could let him be dimensional again, flawed and stubborn in particular, rather than the compressed symbol of loss she'd been carrying for over a decade. That was something she hadn't expected. She hadn't expected that justice, or the closest available approximation of it, would give her father back to her in that way. But that's what it had done. By making his death a matter of fact, rather than a matter of unresolved weight, it had freed him from being only his death. He was other things again. He was Sunday morning and a broken zipper, and a man who had made a decision he believed in, and stuck with it even when it cost him everything. He was her father again, not just her loss. She lay in the dark in the Munising motel and let that be what it was, which was significant without being dramatic, which was the best kind of significant there was. Her phone was on the nightstand. She hadn't looked at it since Pat's diner. She looked at it now. Donnie had texted at 9, "You okay?" And then, 30 minutes later, the single-word follow-up that was more Danny than any paragraph could have been. Obviously, yes, just checking. She typed back, "Yes, having eggs at a diner named after no one. Stars are doing their thing up here. Talk tomorrow." Danny replied immediately with a single image, a thumbs up, which meant she was satisfied and going to sleep, which was the correct response. Vivian set the phone down and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the year ahead. Not with the anxious forward projection she'd sometimes fallen into before the compulsive planning that was really just fear wearing the costume of productivity, but with something more spacious. She had a job she was good at. She had an apartment with south-facing windows and a radiator that knocked. She had Danny, who opened doors at midnight and bought coffee in lobbies and understood which things needed witnesses and which things needed to be private. She had a folder on a shelf above her desk that contained a court document and a letter written in leftward-leaning handwriting and a piece of paper with embossed letters that said her name. She had the information she'd been missing for 11 years, and she had given it to the people whose job was to do something with it. And they were doing something with it. She had herself. That was the thing she kept returning to in the months since October. The discovery that she was still here. Not intact in the sense of undamaged, but intact in the sense of continuous. The person she'd been before Roman Vescari was the same person she was now, just with more of the structure visible, The load-bearing elements exposed in the way that renovation exposes what was always holding the building up. She was going to be fine. Not in the diminished sense that people use that word when they mean they're surviving, in the actual sense. She was going to build something with what she had, and what she had was more than she'd known, and the building was going to be hers. She closed her eyes. Outside the motel window, the small town settled further into its night. The vending machine hummed in the breezeway. Somewhere above Munising, the stars continued their indifferent blazing, and the lake moved in the dark against its cold shore. The birches stood in whatever configuration the wind had found them in, waiting without waiting for the season to change. She slept. In the morning she drove north again, into whatever the road became, carrying what she carried, and the light came in low and clear off the water, and everything ahead of her was unmade and available, and entirely her own.